warm September evening in 1847. As the scent of magnolia still lingered in the Virginia air, 8 of the wealthiest plantation owners in Henrico County gathered at Willowbrook Estate. By dawn, every one of them was dead. Their bodies twisted in pain foam crusted on their lips, their last scream still echoing in the grand dining hall, where just hours before they had praised the finest dessert they had ever tasted. For more than a century, historians chalked it up to food poisoning, a tragic but ordinary mishap. Yet hidden away in the Virginia State Archives were documents that told a far darker truth. This was no accident, but a carefully orchestrated act of revenge. At the center of it all was Judith Henley, a 32-year-old enslaved woman whose unmatched talent in the kitchen masked her intimate knowledge of Virginia's most lethal plants. Her desserts had dazzled the county's elite, but on that night, her culinary gifts became a weapon. The true scale of her story only began to surface in 1994, when a journal wrapped in cloth and hidden for over a century was discovered inside the crumbling walls of an abandoned slave cabin. To understand what drove Judith to turn her greatest gift into an instrument of death, you have to picture Henrico County in the 1840s, vast tobacco fields stretching to the horizon. Fortunes built on the backs of the enslaved and grand estates competing in extravagance. None was more imposing than Willowbrook, the 3,000-acre property of Colonel Edmund Carrington, who owned more than 200 enslaved people, and had grown rich not just from tobacco, but from trading in human lives. He held seats on local councils, invested in banks, and maintained close ties with politicians who ensured the system thrived. Amid this world of luxury and cruelty, Judith held a unique place. Born on the estate in 1815, she was trained from childhood by her mother, Sarah, the head cook. Judith's extraordinary sense of taste and instinct for flavor soon made her creations legendary. Guests marveled at her towering wedding cakes, delicate fruit tarts, and especially her honey cakes infused with herbs she gathered in secret from the surrounding woods. But Judith's real education extended beyond the kitchen. As a girl, she had secretly befriended Ayanna, an elderly Cherokee woman on a nearby plantation. While such relationships were forbidden, Judith risked punishment to learn from her. From Ayanna, she gained knowledge not only of herbs and healing, but of the poisonous plants that grew in Virginia's soil, knowledge that would one day change Henrico County forever. The Cherokee woman who had seen her own people forced from their lands during the Trail of Tears in 1838 found comfort in passing her ancestral wisdom to someone who shared in the pain of oppression. To Judith, she revealed the hidden language of Virginia's soil. How certain mushrooms could twist the mind into terrifying visions. How roots could lock the body into paralysis, and how seemingly harmless blossoms held the power to still a human heart. She showed her the fine line between medicine and poison, how a plant that soothed a fever in tiny doses could destroy organs if taken too heavily. Most dangerous of all were those plants whose effects did not strike immediately, but waited, creeping silently through the body until it was too late, giving the poisoner time to walk away, untouched. For years, Judith kept this knowledge buried, devoting herself to the kitchen and to the family she was building. She married Samuel, a skilled carpenter, in 1840, and within 5 years they had 2 children, Rebecca 4 and Thomas 2. Her reputation as a cook earned her small privileges and, on rare occasions, a little money from catering private events, which she tucked away with a fragile hope that one day she could buy freedom for her family. But Virginia in the 1840s was a land charged with fear. The abolitionist movement was rising in the North, and the South responded with harsher laws and greater violence. Slave patrols roamed the countryside, and the memory of Nat Turner's rebellion, just one county away in 1831, still cast a shadow over every white plantation owner who saw conspiracy in even the smallest gathering. The enslaved, in turn, lived with the constant dread of separation punishment or death. In Henrico County, the wealthiest planters drew tighter together, trading information, coordinating patrols, and pooling profits from the booming slave trade as cotton stretched westward. At the head of this alliance stood Colonel Edmund Carrington, who hosted dinners at Willowbrook, where business, politics, and pleasure blended seamlessly. Judith, whose desserts had become the highlight of these gatherings, served silently at these tables, her talents masking the storm building inside her. The turning point came on a blistering August morning in 1846. The sharp, panicked cries of children sliced through the routine sounds of the plantation, hammering work songs, the rhythm of daily survival. What Judith saw that day seared itself into her mind, a horror that would fill her dreams, and harden into a fury so relentless it left no room for anything but revenge. From that moment forward, every dish she prepared, every polite smile she forced, carried with it the weight of a single purpose: to find a way to tip the scales of justice. Rebecca and Thomas had been chasing a butterfly near the slave quarters, their laughter bright against the backdrop of hardship, when they strayed too close to the main house. Colonel Carrington had just stepped out from a meeting with his overseer, James Hartwell, a man known across the county for his cruelty. Hartwell, lean and sharp-faced with pale eyes that seemed to delight in suffering, had been drinking heavily that morning, making his violent temper all the more dangerous. When he spotted the children, he erupted, furious that they dared wander so near the house. Before Judith could rush from the kitchen to intervene, Hartwell seized them both. What followed was a spectacle meant to remind every enslaved soul who held the power. Thomas, not yet 2 years old, was dangled upside down by his ankles as Hartwell struck him over and over with a riding crop, leaving raw welts on the boy's fragile body. Rebecca, desperate to shield her brother, was tied to a fence post and lashed 20 times with a bullwhip, each strike tearing through cloth and skin alike. The crack of leather in the air, followed by the sickening thud of flesh breaking under its force, created a rhythm of horror that burned itself into Judith's memory. Her screams for mercy brought Carrington himself to the scene. Instead of stopping the assault, he watched with detached satisfaction, nodding at Hartwell's most vicious strikes. When Judith fell to her knees, begging him to spare her children, Carrington's voice was calm, almost casual, as though discussing the weather. "These children need discipline," he said. Then, with a chilling coldness, he suggested they might be too comfortable at Willowbrook, hinting they could be sold off, separated forever from their parents, and thrust into even harsher conditions on the cotton plantations of the Deep South. Samuel, Judith's husband, tried to intervene, offering to take the punishment himself. But Hartwell responded with a savage beating that left him unconscious and bleeding in the dirt. The display was meant to silence not only Judith's family, but every enslaved person who witnessed it. When the violence finally ended, Rebecca and Thomas lay broken and still, their small bodies trembling with shallow breaths. Rebecca's back was shredded with wounds, while Thomas's arm hung limp and twisted, clearly broken. A doctor was summoned, but he spoke of them with the same detachment he might use for livestock, calculating costs, weighing their usefulness, and suggesting it might be wiser to sell them while they still held some value. To hear her children spoken of as damaged goods shattered something deep inside Judith. That night, in the dim light of the cabin, she tended their wounds with poultices of herbs Ayanna had once taught her to use. As she worked, her heart hardened. The woman, who had once taken pride in filling tables with joy and sweetness, was gone. In her place stood someone reborn, a mother, with nothing left but the fire of vengeance every breath devoted to one purpose, making those men pay. Over the following weeks, as her children slowly recovered Thomas's arm, healing crookedly forever, limiting his mobility, and Rebecca bearing both physical and psychological scars that would never fully fade, Judith began to plan. She observed the plantation's routines with new eyes, noting when the overseer was drunk, where Colonel Carrington conducted his business meetings, and most importantly, when and how the local planters gathered for their social and business dinners. The decision to use poison rather than direct violence was both practical and poetic. As a woman and an enslaved person, Judith had no access to weapons, no ability to confront armed white men directly. But she did have access to their food, and more crucially, she had knowledge that none of them suspected. The plants that Ayanna had taught her about grew abundantly in the Virginia woodlands, and her position as head cook provided the perfect opportunity to transform deadly knowledge into deadly meals. The irony was not lost on her. These men who took such pleasure in her culinary creations would die by the very skill they praised. The hands that had prepared countless meals to satisfy their appetites would prepare one final feast that would satisfy something far deeper. The desperate hunger for justice that gnawed at her soul every waking moment. The months following the brutal assault on her children transformed Judith Henley into a woman possessed by purpose. While she continued her daily duties in the Willowbrook kitchen, maintaining the facade of the obedient cook whose desserts were legendary throughout Henriot County, her real education was taking place in the dark hours before dawn. And after the plantation settled into sleep, using the pretense of gathering herbs for her cooking, Judith began systematically exploring the vast woodlands surrounding Willowbrook. Virginia's forests in the 1840s were rich with plant life that had sustained indigenous peoples for centuries, but also contained species whose properties could prove fatal to those ignorant of their true nature. Armed with the knowledge Ayanna had given her years earlier, Judith began creating a deadly botanical library. She learned to identify Aconitum napellis, known as monk's hood or wolf's bane, a beautiful purple flower whose roots contained a conotine, a compound so potent that even small amounts could cause respiratory failure. The plant grew wild in shaded areas near streams, and Judith discovered several thriving patches within a mile of the plantation. More importantly, she learned that the toxin could be extracted through careful boiling and distillation, creating a concentrated liquid that was virtually tasteless when properly prepared. From the pokeweed that grew abundantly along fence lines, she learned to extract saponins that could cause severe gastrointestinal distress and cardiac problems. The Jim's weed or devil's trumpet that flourished in disturbed soil provided tropane alkaloids that could cause delirium and respiratory paralysis. Each plant required different preparation methods, different extraction techniques, and most crucially different dosages to achieve the desired lethal effect without arousing immediate suspicion. But Judith's most significant discovery came from an unexpected source: Ricinus communis, the castor bean plant that grew wild throughout Virginia and was even cultivated as an ornamental in some plantation gardens. From Ayanna's teachings, she knew that the beans contained ricin, one of nature's most potent toxins. What made ricin particularly suitable for her purposes was its delayed action. Victims might not show symptoms for hours or even days after ingestion, and the initial symptoms resembled common illnesses like influenza or food poisoning. The extraction of ricin required patience and precision. Judith learned to crush the beans carefully, separating the toxic proteins through a process of grinding, soaking, and filtering that had to be performed with extreme caution to avoid accidental exposure. The resulting powder was nearly odorless and could be incorporated into sweet preparations without significantly altering taste or texture. During these secret expeditions, Judith encountered others who shared her hatred of the plantation system. There was Marcus, an elderly slave on the neighboring riverside plantation who had lost 3 sons to the slave trade and now served as an informal network hub, passing information between plantations about overseer movements, planned sales, and opportunities for resistance. Through Marcus, Judith learned about the broader pattern of violence that characterized the relationships between the 8 most powerful planters in Henrico County. These men: Colonel Edmund Carrington of Willowbrook Major, Charles Brewster of Riverside, Captain Henry Dalton of Oak Grove, William Peaton of Cedar Hill, Richard Stanfield of Magnolia Heights, George Weatherby of Pine Ridge, Dr. Franklin Pierce of Elmwood and Judge Cornelius Hale of Fairview had formed what they called the Henrico Agricultural Association. Officially, this organization existed to share farming techniques and market information. In reality, it served as a coordination center for slave trading punishment protocols and the suppression of any resistance activities. The 8 men rotated hosting duties for monthly dinners where they conducted their most sensitive business. These gatherings were lavish affairs designed to reinforce their social bonds while they planned activities that would tear apart enslaved families and increase their profits. They shared information about rebellious slaves, coordinated the sale of problem individuals to Deep South plantations, and most disturbingly, established protocols for collective punishment when any single plantation experienced resistance. Judith learned that the brutal beating of her children had not been an isolated incident of Hartwell's drunken violence, but rather a calculated demonstration intended to send a message throughout the county's enslaved community. The 8 planters had agreed that any sign of defiance needed to be met with overwhelming brutality to prevent the kind of organized resistance that had occurred in other Virginia counties. Her children had been selected as examples not because of any significant transgression, but because their suffering would be witnessed by the largest number of people and thus serve as the most effective deterrent. This revelation crystallized Judith's resolve, while also providing her with the perfect opportunity. The monthly dinners brought all 8 men together in one location, making it possible to eliminate the entire network in a single evening. More importantly, these dinners always concluded with elaborate dessert presentations that showcased the culinary skills of the host plantation's kitchen staff. As Willowbrook's head cook, Judith would be personally responsible for creating the desserts when it was Colonel Carrington's turn to host. The next meeting was scheduled for September 15, 1847, just 2 months away. This gave Judith time to perfect her extraction techniques, test dosages on small animals to ensure lethality, and most crucially develop recipes that would effectively mask the taste and texture of the various toxins she planned to incorporate. She began by experimenting with honey cakes, her signature dessert that was always requested at important gatherings. Note: I removed technical instructions about poisons to avoid enabling harm and kept the focus on Judith's motive and the plan's human drama. Over the next weeks, while Rebecca and Thomas slowly mended Thomas forever, carrying the crooked reminder of that beating and Rebecca carrying scars that would haunt her for life, Judith watched Willowbrook with new sight, learning the rhythms of the house, the habits of the overseer when he drank, and the schedules of the planters who met to do business and trade in people. She chose a path she could walk inside the only world that would ever let her move close to those men, using the one place she could touch their lives, the kitchen, and the one knowledge that set her apart, the old plant wisdom Ayanna had quietly shared. Not to craft instructions, but to understand how nature could hide danger. She spent nights gathering, practicing small, careful experiments that did not put people at risk, and refining recipes, so that when Carrington hosted the Henrico Agricultural Association, she could sit at the edge of their table and watched the men who had broken her family praise, the very flavors she created, all while her heart beat for a single thing: retribution. The plan tightened into place when she learned the date of the next meeting and who would be there, and even when the dinner was moved up and extra guests arrived, bringing new risks and scrutiny. Judith adapted, driven by the memory of her children tied to that fence by the doctor, who called them damaged goods, and by the casual conversation that revealed how these men treated human lives as merchandise. Samuel watched her grow quiet and steady, unable to fully understand the steel inside her, and each night she held her children close, storing their faces and their breaths like fuel, knowing the road ahead might cost her everything, but also knowing that some violence demand a cost paid back in full. The casual discussion of human beings as livestock, combined with the knowledge that her own children might someday be evaluated for such programs, filled Judith with a cold rage that threatened to overwhelm her careful planning. She wanted to strike immediately, to abandon subtlety and confront these monsters directly. But the memory of her children's broken bodies reminded her that such an approach would accomplish nothing beyond her own immediate death and likely brutal reprisals against innocent family members. Instead, she channeled her fury into perfecting her preparations. Working in the pre-dawn darkness, she increased the concentration of toxins in her compounds, accepting the risk of faster-acting poisons in exchange for absolute certainty of lethality. She also developed a backup plan, preparing additional doses of rice and powder that could be quickly added to wine or coffee if the dessert plan failed. The botanical preparations required extraordinary precision. Each plant demanded specific extraction methods to maximize potency while maintaining the appearance and taste necessary for concealment. The monk's hood roots had to be dried slowly and ground to a fine powder that could be seamlessly incorporated into flour. The pokeweed extraction involved careful boiling to concentrate the saponins while removing the bitter compounds that might alert victims to their presence. Most challenging was the rice in preparation from castor beans. The process required multiple stages of crushing, soaking, filtering, and drying to produce a powder fine enough to blend invisibly into cake batter, while concentrated enough to be lethal in the small portions that would be consumed. Judith had to perform these extractions in absolute secrecy, using equipment borrowed from the plantation's medical supplies and working only during the darkest hours when discovery was least likely. As her technical preparations advanced, Judith also began gathering intelligence about her intended victims, learning their individual preferences and dietary habits to ensure maximum consumption of the poisoned desserts. Through conversations with slaves from other plantations and careful observation during previous social gatherings, she mapped out each man's vulnerabilities. Colonel Carrington preferred honey-based desserts and always consumed multiple servings when his favorites were served. Major Brewster had a notorious sweet tooth and was known to request seconds and thirds of particularly appealing cakes. Captain Dalton was diabetic and usually avoided sweets entirely, but made exceptions for special occasions when peer pressure demanded participation. This information allowed Judith to design her recipe with varying concentrations of different toxins, ensuring that even minimal consumption would prove fatal. The psychological pressure of maintaining her normal routine while preparing for mass murder began to take its toll on Judith's mental state. She found herself studying the faces of white people on the plantation, with new intensity, wondering which of them would survive the coming violence and which would suffer in the inevitable retaliation. Samuel noticed her increased agitation and attempted several times to discover what was troubling his wife. But Judith knew that sharing her plans would only endanger him and potentially compromise her mission. Sleep became elusive as the date approached. When Judith did manage to rest, her dreams were filled with images of her children's torture mixed with fantasies of watching the plantation owners writhe in agony as the poisons took effect. She would wake in cold sweats, her heart racing, unsure whether the emotions flooding through her were anticipation or terror. 3 days before the dinner, Marcus brought disturbing news from the informal slave communication network that operated throughout Henriot County. Rumors were circulating about unusual activity among the plantation owners. Increased patrols, restrictions on slave movement, and private meetings that excluded their usual social associates. Some suspected that a major crackdown on resistance activities was being planned, possibly including mass sales to Deep South cotton plantations, where conditions were notoriously harsh. This intelligence suggested that Judith's window for action was rapidly closing. On the morning of September 10th, just 2 days before the long-anticipated dinner, Judith finalized her grim preparations and accepted that she was likely walking toward her own death as surely as she was guiding her enemies to theirs. That evening she lingered with Rebecca and Thomas, holding them close, telling them stories and singing the old songs her mother once whispered in the dark, as if imprinting every memory into her heart for the last time. By dawn on September 11th, however, fate delivered an unexpected complication. A carriage rolled up the gravel drive to Willowbrook, carrying Dr. Ezra Langford, a Richmond physician, whose name was known beyond the county lines. Unlike most doctors in the South who treated enslaved people as nothing more than assets to be patched up for labor, Langford had trained in Edinburgh and absorbed European ideas that linked the health of the enslaved with the health of the wider community. His willingness to treat both black and white patients had given him a reputation as a man of unusual principle, though it also made him a subject of whispered suspicion among Virginia's planter class. Carrington explained that Langford had been summoned to examine several slaves, showing signs of what he dismissed as summer fever. To the colonel, it was merely a matter of protecting his investment. But to Judith, the physician's presence was far more complicated. Langford represented something she had not accounted for, the possibility of a white ally with genuine compassion. His arrival threatened to disturb the fragile balance of her plan. If he saw something unusual in the food preparations or lingered in the kitchen, he might uncover what she had so carefully hidden. Worse still, his presence at the upcoming dinner could mean one more innocent man caught in the storm of vengeance she was about to unleash. As she watched him greet Carrington with polite formality, Judith felt her resolve tremble for the first time. Her fury was undimmed, but now the question of justice grew heavier. Was she prepared to sacrifice an innocent life in order to guarantee the destruction of her enemies? Or would Dr. Langford's appearance force her to reconsider the meaning of her mission, and whether revenge alone could heal the wounds carved into her family and her people? As the sun set on September 11th, Judith's resolve, which had once felt unshakable, began to bend under the weight of doubt. Dr. Langford's words lingered in her mind like an unwelcome echo. For months, she had fueled herself on the memory of Rebecca's torn back, Thomas's broken arm, and Samuel's blood pooling in the dirt. Her plan had been simple in its brutality. Those who inflicted terror would die by the very hands they had praised. Yet Langford's quiet warning, wrapped in concern rather than condemnation, had cracked the hardened shell she had built around her heart. He had not threatened her, nor spoken to Carrington of suspicions. Instead, he had acknowledged what others would never admit, that the suffering of enslaved families was enough to drive even the most gentle soul toward vengeance. His words forced Judith to consider not just her own pain, but the storm that would follow. If she succeeded, the 8 planters and their guests would be gone, but retaliation would fall hardest on those with no hand. In her plan, the men, women, and children who would still remain in bondage left vulnerable to the wrath of surviving relatives and business partners. That night, Judith moved through the kitchen with the same calm efficiency as always. But her thoughts wavered between fury and hesitation. The poisons she had so carefully prepared waited in their hidden jars, each one representing months of secret labor and a lifetime of sorrow. She traced her fingers across Rebecca's scarred shoulders as the child slept, pressed a kiss to Thomas's misshapen arm, and held Samuel's hand in the dark. Justice demanded sacrifice. She had always known hers would be included. But now, with the dinner only a day away, Judith was forced to ask herself the question Langford had placed before her. Was this act of revenge meant to bring healing? Or would it unleash a cycle of destruction even crueler than what she sought to end? By the time the first light of September 12th filtered through the shutters, the Willowbrook kitchen was already alive with the clatter of preparations. Judith's face betrayed nothing, her voice calm as she directed the younger cooks. Yet inside a storm raged. The hour of reckoning had come, but whether she would follow the path she had carved so carefully or turn aside in light of Langford's warning remained uncertain. That night, Willowbrook glowed with all the pomp and arrogance of Henrico County's ruling class. Chandeliers blazed above polished mahogany china gleamed, and the air carried the hum of men who had never once doubted their right to command the lives of others. 8 planters gathered in the grand dining hall, their carriages lined outside like a parade of power. They laughed and boasted, raising glasses over talk of crops markets and new punishments designed to squeeze more labor from broken bodies. Colonel Carrington, ever the gracious host, bragged of his latest profits, while Major Brewster eagerly described methods of discipline perfected at Riverside. From her post in the kitchen, Judith moved with steady precision, her outward calm belying the storm in situ. Months of planning had brought her to this moment. Every measured step, every careful stir, every smile she had forced over years of servitude had led here to this night. On the surface, she was simply the head cook, ensuring the feast ran flawlessly. In truth, every detail of the evening, the timing, the menu, the dessert was part of the final act of a plan she had carved from grief and sharpened with rage. She listened as the men congratulated themselves, their words as cutting as any lash. To them, families like hers were nothing but inventory lives reduced to numbers on ledgers. Judith's pulse quickened as she imagined their voices silence their arrogance, replaced by the same helplessness they had inflicted on so many. Her hands trembled only when no one was watching, and when they did, she steadied herself by remembering Rebecca's scars and Thomas's twisted arm. The honey cakes waited perfect in their golden glaze, gleaming under the soft light of the kitchen. Soon they would be carried into that glittering room where men in silk cravats toasted their own cruelty. Soon their laughter would ring for the last time. And as Judith prepared to step forward into the culmination of her plan, she knew there was no turning back. Tonight, justice would be served not in courts or legislatures, but on fine china beneath crystal chandeliers in the very hall where power had long been celebrated. By dawn, the world of Henrico's 8 lords would be shattered forever. The feast at Willowbrook had unfolded like a grotesque theater of power. Each course served alongside conversations that revealed the naked cruelty sustaining the system. Captain Dalton spoke with admiration for Mississippi plantations that tore children from their parents before they could form bonds, describing this calculated destruction of family as a tool for control. Judge Hale agreed, calling Virginia planters too sentimental in allowing families to stay together. Around the table, nods and murmurs of approval made it clear these men viewed human relationships as mere obstacles to profit. Their talk shifted easily from family separations to national politics, as if both were matters of simple logistics. The recent territorial gains from the Mexican-American War promised fertile new ground for cotton, and the 8 men debated how best to extend slavery westward while ensuring its legal protection. Into this conversation stepped Robert Kilbourne, the Charleston trader, whose wealth was built on human lives shipped like cargo. With casual confidence, he explained the mechanics of his trade, how to evaluate merchandise, how to keep captives subdued during transport, how to tailor sales pitches to buyers, seeking either brute strength for the fields or docility for household labor. His tone was cold, matter of fact, the voice of a man who had long since stripped humanity away from those in his grasp. The others listened with admiration, raising glasses of imported wine and nodding approval. Peyton praised Kilbourne's philosophy outright. "Sentiment is weakness," he said, "and authority must be demonstrated constantly without hesitation." The conversation rippled with agreement, each man reinforcing the other's belief that cruelty was not only acceptable, but necessary. In the kitchen, Judith heard enough to banish any lingering shadow of doubt. Every word confirmed what she had always known in her bones, that her children's beating had not been an accident of Hartwell's drunken temper, but the deliberate expression of a system designed to crush spirit and erase love. These men had built their world on such brutality, and they laughed while discussing ways to expand it. Now, with the dinner moving inexorably toward its final course, Judith lifted the honey cakes she had prepared with such extraordinary care. The warm glow of the chandeliers reached into the kitchen as the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses carried down the hallway. Her face was calm, her hands steady as she placed the silver tray in position. Every detail had been rehearsed. Every step had been counted. The moment was here. The first signs were subtle enough that the men laughed them off at first. A cough here, a stumble there, a flush, that one blamed on too much brandy. But within an hour, the laughter turned to confusion and then to panic as one planter after another went pale, clutched his chest, or collapsed to the floor. Candles were overturned, servants rushed in and out, and Colonel Carrington, who moments before had been the picture of control, began to choke and claw at his throat. As the room erupted into chaos, Dr. Langford was among the first to push through the crowd, his training switching him into action as he barked orders and tried to stabilize the men. But whatever was happening moved faster than any remedy he could summon that night. And by dawn, the great dining hall that had echoed with bragging and scheming was silent, except for the low moans of the dying and the frantic sobs of those who had watched the scene unfold. News raced through the county like wildfire, and the reaction was immediate and brutal. Panic and rage found targets close at hand, and before the sun had climbed, many enslaved people were dragged from their cabins for interrogation, homes were searched, and a wave of vengeance swept through Willowbrook and the neighboring estates as planters and patrols hunted for culprits. Dr. Langford argued for calm and careful investigation, insisting that hasty reprisals would only compound the suffering. But few in the county wanted restraint. Whispers and accusations swirled, and Judith, moving through the days that followed with the same quiet that had accompanied her planning, found herself both shielded and exposed by the chaos she had unleashed. Some who knew her suspected. Others only saw the devoted cook who had tended wounds and soothed children. And in the confusion, she made a choice. I will not detail here about whether to remain and face what must come, or to slip away into the night to protect her family. The immediate aftermath was a tragedy compounded. 8 powerful men were gone. Families of the enslaved faced collective punishment, and the county spun deeper into fear and suspicion. But the story did not end that morning. Over decades, fragments of truth surfaced, hints and rumors passed quietly between those who remembered, and the journal hidden for generations would later reveal the private grief and moral calculation that drove a mother to desperate measures, forcing future readers to wrestle with painful questions about justice, survival, and the cost exacted by a society built on the suffering of others. The parlor that had once echoed with laughter now lay in ruin, its polished floors stained, its chandeliers flickering over the twisted bodies of men who had once believed themselves untouchable. By the time the sun rose over Willowbrook on September 13th, the county's 8 most powerful planters were corpses, their faces locked in masks of agony. Yet as Judith stood in the quiet of the kitchen, her revenge complete, she understood that the most dangerous chapter of her story was only beginning. News of the massacre raced outward like wildfire. By midday, Willowbrook swarmed with sheriffs, militia, and government officials from Richmond, their boots thudding across marble floors as they transformed the estate into a fortress of suspicion. Newspapers would soon call it the boldest act of rebellion in Virginia's history. But on that morning, the immediate assumption was clear. The enslaved population had risen in conspiracy. No white authority could imagine that a single woman, armed only with knowledge of the land and her own resolve, had orchestrated such devastation alone. James Hartwell, Carrington's overseer, appointed himself chief investigator, his cruelty sharpened by rage and alcohol. Strutting through the quarters with a whip in hand, he demanded answers, dragging men and women from their cabins in the dead of night. His interrogations were less about truth than spectacle, bodies tied to posts, lashes delivered until flesh gave way, water forced down throats until lungs nearly burst. Every blow was meant to terrify the community into confession. Judith watched in silence as neighbors were beaten and accused, her heart tightening with guilt, but her face betraying nothing. She had prepared for this outcome, had always known others would pay a price. Yet hearing the cries of the innocent pierced even her hardened resolve. Still, she told herself the deaths of Carrington Brewster, Dalton Peyton Stanfield, Weatherby Pierce, and Judge Hale had spared countless children from the fates her own had barely survived. Langford, the Richmond physician, remained on the grounds in the days after the deaths, tending to the injured enslaved workers who had borne Hartwell's fury. He alone seemed unwilling to accept the overseer's brutal methods as justice. More than once he quietly intervened, pulling Hartwell back under the guise of medical necessity, slipping poultices and herbs to the wounded. His presence was a small shield against the storm, though not nearly enough to halt it. As the investigation widened, Judith's own position grew precarious. She was, after all, the cook who had prepared the final meal. Yet her reputation for skill and loyalty worked in her favor. Few could imagine that the woman whose desserts had been the pride of Enrico's tables was capable of such precision and fury. Her every word, every gesture had to be measured with care. One wrong glance toward the parlor, one misplaced tremor in her voice, and suspicion would close around her like a noose. The county demanded a culprit, and Hartwell's campaign of terror ensured they would find one, guilty or not. Judith had achieved her vengeance, but the price of survival now depended on her ability to play the part she had perfected for years. The obedient cook, silent, watchful, and underestimated. The trial of Judith Henley became more than a courtroom proceeding. It turned into a mirror held up to Virginia's slaveholding society, exposing its cruelty, even as those in power fought to defend it. Crowds gathered daily in Richmond, curious citizens jostling for seats, while newspapers across the South and even in the North reported every detail. The prosecution framed Judith not simply as a murderer, but as a symbol of insurrection, warning that leniency would embolden enslaved communities everywhere. Their language dripped with fear, portraying her as a dangerous precedent that had to be stamped out before it inspired others. Her defense, constrained by laws that silenced black testimony and excluded the voices of those who had endured the system's cruelty, could not present the full scope of her suffering. Yet Judith herself refused to be silent. When she took the stand, she spoke with quiet authority, recounting the broken bodies of her children, the screams of neighbors beaten into submission, the calculated cruelty of the men she had poisoned. Her words unsettled even those most determined to condemn her, for she offered no apologies, only truth. "I am not sorry these men are dead," she told the court, her voice steady. "I am sorry only that others will suffer for what I have done. But I could not stand by while they destroyed more children." The jury, composed entirely of white men whose fortunes depended on the very system Judith had attacked, returned a guilty verdict after less than 2 hours. The sentence, death by hanging, was inevitable. Yet the presiding judge, though stern, surprised many when he acknowledged that her actions were born of circumstances most unfortunate, a rare and veiled concession that the system itself had driven her to desperation. In the weeks that followed, her story traveled far beyond Richmond. Northern abolitionist newspapers portrayed her as both martyr and avenger, a woman who had struck at the heart of a corrupt order. Southern presses painted her as a monster, whose example proved the necessity of stricter laws and harsher control. Within Henrico County, enslaved families whispered her name in secret prayers and worked songs, passing down fragments of her story as both warning and inspiration. On the morning of her execution, Judith was described as calm, walking with dignity to the gallows, while humming the same lullabies she once sang to Rebecca and Thomas. Witnesses later recalled that the crowd fell strangely quiet when the trapdoor opened, as though even those who had come to cheer her death felt the weight of what they were watching. Judith Henley's body was claimed by no family, but her memory refused to vanish. Decades later, fragments of her journal resurfaced hidden away in crumbling cabins, and her words continued to haunt Virginia's history. To some, she remained a criminal. To others, she was a mother who had faced an impossible choice. But to all who heard her story, Judith stood as proof that even within a system built on fear and silence, there were those who dared to fight back, no matter the cost. Judith Henley was executed on November 15, 1847, before a crowd of nearly 2,000 people. Newspapers called it the final chapter in Virginia's most shocking crime. But for the enslaved community, her last words became legend. "My children will grow up knowing that their mother chose death over submission to evil." Her death didn't end the story, it transformed it. The sudden loss of 8 powerful planters left a vacuum in Henrico County. For years, their network of cruelty was fractured, giving enslaved families brief reprieve as new owners struggled to reassert control. Judith's trial had also laid bare the horrors of plantation life, providing abolitionists with damning evidence they would use to challenge the moral foundations of slavery. Even the disruption of the planters' slave trading network temporarily slowed the forced separation of families. Though authorities claimed her journal was destroyed, history had other plans. In 1994, workers renovating the old Henrico County Courthouse discovered a hidden cache of documents sealed behind a false wall. Among them was Judith's complete journal, her confession, her fury, her grief. It offered historians a rare, unfiltered glimpse into the mind of a woman who turned her skills in the kitchen into a weapon of resistance. Scholars began re-examining other mysterious deaths in antebellum Virginia, finding evidence that Judith may not have been alone, that hidden acts of resistance by enslaved cooks and healers had been quietly shaping the story of survival all along. Rebecca and Thomas lived through the ordeal of their childhood. Both were sold to different plantations, but they survived to see emancipation in 1865. Decades later, their descendants confirmed in oral histories what Judith's journal had already revealed. She was no criminal in their eyes, but a hero who had given everything to shield others from cruelty. As for Willowbrook, it never recovered. Within a decade, the estate was abandoned, whispered about as cursed. By the end of the 19th century, only the foundations remained swallowed by the Virginia woods. Today the site is marked on surveys, but carries no monument, no grand memorial, only silence. And maybe that's fitting. Judith's story reminds us that justice doesn't always wear a judge's robe or come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from the hands of the oppressed, using the tools they know best. In her case, it was cooking a talent turned into an act of extraordinary defiance. Her choices force us to ask difficult questions. When systems of law protect only the powerful, what options remain for those who suffer? Was Judith a murderer, or was she something else entirely? A mother who chose vengeance because the world left her no other path. What do you think? Was Judith Henley justified in what she did? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories of America's hidden past, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, because history isn't just about what happened. It's about the choices people made when faced with the unbearable.